compromise. But I think that the regulatory environment will be actually the process by which you deliver on the intent of all of the negotiations. So, for example, agriculture, food. If you were to look at the hugely wide variety, or the wide variety of differences in ingredients, ingredient standards, quality, packaging, there's a huge inefficiency that gets driven into the ultimate cost of what you're trying to protect as a cheap product into developing markets, for example, consumers. And a lot of time, it's just nuances. And if the regulatory environment would be such that you could come together and have a far greater standardization, all it does is reduce cost. With reduction in cost, you bring down the ultimate cost to the end consumer, et cetera. I think, again, with the agricultural sort of barrier starting to be removed, that'll be the next phase in all of this, which is that the regulations then have to be aligned in order to be able to deliver on the intent, which is a greater flow of goods and agriculture across all countries.
Well, I think that there's a set of issues around IT that are somewhat unique to telecom, being one, getting that framework right. I mean, a lot of countries that really use telecom regulation essentially as a trade barrier, and to the detriment of their entire IT ecosystem. Privacy, which we alluded to before, where countries have competing and sometimes, frankly, protectionist, use privacy as a protectionist tool. But there are other areas as well. I put antitrust there, that we don't need a much better framework on global antitrust for some of these services industries. And then there are sort of more sectoral-based ones, health being one. The U.S. and Europe are both Europe's trying to develop a continental health IT arrangement where we have a health record in France, it's good in Holland. But we need to think much bigger than that. Ultimately, everyone on the global have a health IT record. And we need to be starting to think about how would we get a global health framework so that those records and those systems are all completely interoperable. So there's a lot of challenges there, and I think in some ways IT is really critical to this. Again, for IT to work best, it really has to be global. One of the great things about IT is you build a piece of software, and you have high fixed costs and low marginal costs, and so a bigger market is the most efficient way to do this.
Next question. Yes.
David Goldberg again from Hong Kong. Just specifically alluding to something that Bill mentioned earlier on the international movement of labour being one of his highest priorities. Maybe pleased to know that I was invited up to Beijing last week to talk to a meeting of APEC labour ministers on exactly this subject. The depressing element of this is that this is the first meeting of labour ministers in APEC for 9 years. And I think that comes to a point that seems to be arising at various levels, and that is the services negotiations are complex and they involve multiple agencies, and in contexts like the international movement of labour, these are agencies that are not familiar with the process of interaction. Fred Bergson said this is happening in finance and in ICT. That's perfectly true, but perhaps they're the exceptions that prove the rule. When I'm looking at farm trade in China and the huge gains that have been potentially referred to in making more efficient the supply chain in China, the cool chain, temperature control chain, so vast gains that can be achieved in those areas. You've got to deal with the health ministry and you've got to deal with the farm ministry, and neither of those are ministries that are familiar with or willing to cede regulatory turf to multilateral agencies. So it strikes me that in a number of areas of services activity, the habit of being involved in international, multilateral discussion very ill developed. In some others, they are better developed. And that maybe forces us to focus on particular parts of the services economy, give them priority if we're going to get traction in a very, very short period of time between now and perhaps the end of 2011. In that context, I wonder whether across the panel there are any thoughts about perhaps not sector-specific potential achievements, but generic regulatory or other barriers to the delivery of trade-in services that could be tackled as generic issues rather than as rather sensitive sector-specific issues.
So if I take your question, you're asking, are there some equivalents we could think of to services to things like the Swiss formulas for tariff cutting? In other words, that there are some broad principles that would work pretty well and advance us a long way in all these areas, and people could take exceptions to them that would be there. So an example of that, I would suppose, would be some of the ideas have been floated from the United States about clearer applications of national treatment and automatic ratcheting up. And since even having spent a year just now at USTR, I never understand what these words mean either. Let me try to translate it to the best of my mind. And Christine Bliss is sitting over there, probably tell me it's wrong. But the basic idea is that we make clearer that if countries start to liberalize entry and competition in a service sector inside of their country for one firm, that it automatically translates into non-discriminatory treatment of all firms. And so that what's happened in a lot of countries is there's kind of an internal national champion approach where one firm is allowed to test the water and nobody else is. But the idea would be it would automatically apply to all firms, at least from other WTO members, and presumably that would be the case for the domestic industry as well. Is that an example of what you're thinking about? Okay, so now I've done my, is that right, Christine?
No, it's right. I was just going to add.
I didn't know it was the first word you said.
The ratchet feature, which is interesting, is the concept we applied in our FTAs, is that once you liberalize, you don't go backwards.
Can you use the microphone for a second? Right there behind you.
Sorry. Yeah, the only thing I would add is that the ratchet concept, which is something we've used in our FTAs, is the notion that once you've liberalized, you don't go backwards.
Right.
So you ratchet it in place, in other words. So the example you gave is right, but even more importantly is once you make that liberalization applied on an MFN basis, you don't later remove it.
Right, right. No going back. So let me have the panel comment if they have any particular candidates for this or any thoughts about this at all.
I'll leave it for Christine to answer. Further.
I don't have a comment on the specific, but I want to bring it up a level because I think a lot of the reasons why this is so hard, and I don't want to be somewhat maybe either controversial or maybe outside the box. I think fundamentally the vast majority of countries are pursuing a fundamentally flawed growth strategy. And by that I mean most countries look at how they grow their economy by driving exports and moving up the value chain. Mostly exports of goods up the value chain. And a lot of the services agreement, a lot of the service discussion is sort of in that same box. Well, we'll drive exports of our services and therefore we will grow. When you really look at where most economies grow not from exports, not even from exporting firms. Most economies grow from how well their domestic serving sectors do. Their farms, their retail sector, their banks, their wholesale trade sector, their government sector, their education sector.